Hi to everyone on the line. I guess we're going to get started now. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Where the Rubber Meets the Road, Real-World Context and the Role of Implementers. I'm Claire Cole, Technical Advisor for Best Practices at Pathfinder International, and I'm here today with my colleague Joseph Petralia, Senior Behavior Change Advisor. On behalf of Pathfinder and USAID's Evidence to Action project, I want to welcome our keynote speaker, Laura Damschroeder of the VA Center for Clinical Management Research. I also want to welcome our respondents, Nandita Tate, Research Technical Advisor at USAID, and Laura Gay, Vice President of Research at EGPATH. So we have what we hope will be an interesting and engaging look at a core area of implementation science: context, its relationship to health service delivery and implementation, and what all this might mean for the role of implementers in global health. We have a full hour, and we're hoping for rich discussion. So this is a timely conversation in many ways. Though implementation science discussions have been developing over the last 20 years domestically, they're more recently a growing part of global health conversations. And this is evidenced in many of the conversations that have happened even this year. In September, FHI 360 held an implementation science symposium that brought together both domestic and global health researchers and implementers. And we know we have a lot of FHI 360 folks on the line right now. We're so glad you were able to join us. We're looking forward to discussing with you. Then earlier this month in Cape Town, we had the Health Systems Global Conference, and from there we heard calls for attention not only to effectiveness, but also to learning, problem solving, and improved decision making about the process of implementation. And then if we want to look forward, raise our eyes to the horizon, this December, NIH and Academy Health will host the 7th annual conference on the science of dissemination and implementation, followed by what we hope you'll mark your calendars for. The IBP initiative will have its semi-annual meeting where we're hoping to continue the conversation. So just to review the agenda, we'll hear from Laura Damschroeder in a moment. Laura is author of Fostering Implementation of Health Services Research Findings into Practice, a consolidated framework for advancing implementation science, among many other articles. The CFIR, as it's called, has been applied domestically to support understanding of the interplay of evidence-based practices across diverse health service settings. So we'll hear from Laura about the place of context in the field of implementation science, its significance, and how these implications are changing thinking about health service delivery domestically so we can think about what it might mean for global health. Then following Laura's talk, we'll discuss 2 examples from the field, one from an E2A project in Niger and one from a Pathfinder project in Mozambique, and discuss some potential lessons there. And then we'll hear from our respondents, Nandita and Laura, and hopefully we will manage to make it through with time for a great conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Laura Damschroeder.
Hello. I'm going to talk about implementation research and the role of implementation research and context. And my examples will be domestic examples, but then at the end of my talk I will have a few words about the importance of this for global health as well. And certainly you have the advantage of kind of standing on the shoulders of a lot of the work that has been done in Europe and North America as well. Next slide. So the traditional, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And the traditional research framework that that interventionist researchers or kind of more traditional health services researchers, we focus on problem identification and using observational research next, and use that information to design efficacy or effectiveness trials that test interventions that address the gaps that have been identified next. And then we hopefully, ideally, published in JAMA. Go ahead and click next and next again. And if we're lucky enough, we get published in a top-tier journal. And we consider our hit next, that our work is mission accomplished. Go ahead and click next until you get the mission accomplished showing up. Sorry about the extra animation in these slides. And then we circle back around again and go ahead and click next and repeat the cycle. And so go ahead and click next to the next slide. And with our JAMA, the publication of our work, we really kind of have this natural framework or this natural dissemination and implementation framework where we think that our great work in our published work will be picked up by people and disseminated, and then individual organizations will make decisions to adopt this wonderful intervention, and then do the hard work within each of the organizations, within each of the clinics and communities of implementing that practice or that intervention, and then sustaining that until the next new intervention comes along, and that this process is repeated in organizations worldwide. And this is pretty much the framework that we've been operating under for decades. And under this framework, it takes anywhere from 7 to 20 years, and sometimes still waiting for innovations or tested evidence-based interventions to be used in the real world on a wide scale. So click next. There's a proliferation of reviews. 75 trials and 11 systematic reviews are published per day, according to one article. I have the reference at the bottom of the slide here. And the point with this slide is simply to show the exponential growth in the number and the amount of information that we have available about the evidence base for medical care or healthcare related interventions. So what is the state of science, and what have we learned from that? Click next. Some authors have characterized our current kind of state of knowledge as actually moving in reverse because of inconsistent use of terms and definitions, for one thing, and theory is often used as a heuristic. Compounding this issue are another set of authors that characterize our current state of knowledge as stagnant, at least in relation to one kind of class of interventions around audit and feedback, but I would say that this is true with other complex and especially behavior change interventions as well, and that it's stagnant in part not only because of kind of the lack of language or consistent language that allows us to efficiently synthesize across diverse studies and settings, but also that we're not transparent and we don't report what is going on in context and the kind of information that's needed to implement or scale up to get these practices into real-world use. Click next. So, for example, if you look at Cochrane reviews of especially multi-level, kind of more complex behavior change strategies, which I think we're all pretty much universally involved with, there's hardly such thing as a simple intervention. But a review of quality and safety teams in acute care that was published in 2011, the findings, and this is a direct quote, the findings revealed limited information about attributes of successful and unsuccessful team initiatives, barriers and facilitators to team initiatives, this is about context, unique or combined contribution of selected interventions, or how to effectively establish these teams. And so then I ask, well, what do we know? A lot of reviews talk about the what, so that, for example, they may have found in this same report that quality and safety teams have maybe a moderate or a weak or mixed effect, which that is the finding of a lot of the more complex behavior change interventions. But nearly all of the Cochrane reviews that I look at, in conclusion, say, but more research is needed about the context and about adaptations, about the kind of the active ingredients of the intervention that was being evaluated. Click next. So what is, first of all, just a kind of taking a step back and looking at some definitions. What is implementation versus dissemination? A lot of people talk about D&I as if it's like, one word. The Germans are good at stringing multiple words together to make a single word. But these are two very different activities. Dissemination is simply the act of spreading something, especially information, widely, and it involves broadcasting or circulating. And there's kind of a, if we stop at dissemination, then there's kind of this assumption that the information will be absorbed and used by the organizations that we're hoping will take it up. Implementation, on the other hand, are the efforts designed to get those innovations into use in real-world clinical settings or communities. And it involves the very hard work of preparation and execution. Click next. In implementation research, our foundational question really is not just what works or what are the benefits, but what works where and why, both in terms of the clinical intervention itself and around the implementation activities that are needed to get that innovation into use. Click next. So when looking at the innovations, and by innovations I mean the actual clinical practices or the behavior change programming or behaviors that we are looking to change based on, for example, efficacy or effectiveness coming out of clinical trials. So now we've got this program or practice, and I just refer to those universally as innovations, clinical innovations or community-based innovations. And they're aimed at improving health and well-being among individuals, among patients, among members of a community. And any of us, I'm sure that many of us, or perhaps all of us, have at least attempted to get funding, a proposal funded, and have gone through kind of the throes and the agony of writing proposals. And one of the requirements of a proposal, at least with publicly funded like NIH or Veterans Affairs, is that we have to propose an underlying theoretical framework that gives the rationale and explanation as to why we think this innovation will work among the targeted population. And the job of implementation, what implementation research really brings to the table in this process, is really looking at what are the active ingredients of the innovation that is being tested, and then using that information to help guide adaptation of that innovation, because adaptation really is inevitable, and we really don't pay attention to this in our traditional kind of clinical trial paradigm. Click next. So then when we layer implementation activities on top of the innovation, or to get that innovation into use, our questions, we also need, just like with the innovation itself, we also need theories about why we think particular implementation strategies will work or not work in local settings. And so we have explanatory implementation theories as well, which also include hypotheses and assumptions about how the implementation interventions will facilitate desired change. And the questions here really are focused on barriers and facilitators, so really trying to understand the local context. And we also want to understand why did the innovation not work. And again, we need both of these. If you click next, both of these activities, both the innovation itself and the implementation efforts that it takes to get people to use and uptake that innovation, and theories about the approaches together that accrue program benefits. Click next. So now I'm just going to walk through a case study, and this is within the Veterans Affairs healthcare system and involving a weight management program, and this is based on a published paper. Click next. So I'm sure that in your work you find variability. As soon as you're working with more than one entity, more than one clinic, more than one community, more than one inpatient unit, you're going to find variability. So in this particular case study, it was a small case study because it was a mixed methods qualitative study where we really focused into getting more in depth about really understanding the context, why a year and a half later a program was disseminated, why there's this big variation in the number of patients that actually went through this program. So it varied all the way from nearly 0 when we started to above 60 patients per 1,000. But the point here is not the numbers themselves, but the degree of variation. So we really wanted to try to understand what are the barriers and facilitators to implementation of this particular program. Click next. We developed a framework called, go ahead and click next until you get the, maybe one more time. Okay, that's good. The Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, which we call the CFIR. When we went to the literature to try to find a framework that was comprehensive, that included all of the variables and concepts that we wanted to, that we thought were important in our particular context, we really found just a plethora of frameworks and models that have been published in the literature. And if you go to any single one of these, they lacked something. So we found ourselves wanting to kind of pick and choose between the different frameworks and models. But then the other issue we ran up against was inconsistent use of concepts and definitions. So leaders in one framework would be different than the leaders in another framework, or the activity of goal setting would be different in one versus another. And so what we set out to do is create a framework that provides a standard set of constructs, so theoretical constructs that are thought to influence implementation, that have either been shown to or theoretically influence implementation across 5 different domains. So we identified 39 constructs in total. Click next. So this CFIR framework recognizes that the importance of the characteristics of the intervention or the innovation itself. For example, the more complex the innovation is, the more difficult it's going to be to implement. Click next. Then we also recognize that there are individuals that are that we are trying to get to do something different. Whether it's in implementation research, we're focused on the providers, the clinicians, staff, the people who are actually delivering or engaged, and they have to change behaviors too in order to implement a new program or a new process. Click next. And then we also recognize that individuals reside or are embedded within an inner setting, so which contains its own kind of dynamics that can work for or against implementation efforts. And constructs within the inner setting include things like, are the leaders on board? Are they engaged in this implementation process? What are the quality and the nature of the working relationships between entities or units within the inner setting? Click next. And then we also recognize that the inner setting itself, in turn, is embedded within the outer setting. And the outer setting includes things like payment policies or other government policies that may influence the ability to be able to implement a program. Click next. And then we also, go ahead and we also, the 5th domain is the process domain. And the CFIR, because it's more explanatory and kind of high level, is not prescriptive about how exactly you do implementation, but is more capturing the 4 key constructs or the 4 key types of activities that really are necessary for successful implementation. Planning, engaging key stakeholders, executing the plan with high quality and incrementally, perhaps iteratively, and then doing a feedback and evaluation and in a cyclical approach. So click next. So in our case study of this weight management program, we came up with a list of, in the left column are a list of constructs, and then we rated the presence of those constructs and the influence of those constructs across 4 of the facilities is what I'm showing in this slide. Go ahead and click once. So for example, looking at networks and communications, we can see a clear difference between the high implementation sites on the right and the low implementation sites on the 2 left columns. So the -2s in the low and the +2s in the high implementation sites. So what this tells us is that the quality of the working relationships and the kind of the team building that occurs and the team functioning that occurs within the facilities is a key distinguishing or a key determinant of successful implementation of this particular program. And we likewise look for patterns like that with each of the constructs within the framework. Click next. So then go ahead and click next. We can take this information, and when we're using a consistent kind of menu of constructs and of definitions and ways of kind of conceptualizing, then that allows us to mix studies together and synthesize results and really start to get at this question of what works where and why. So for example, with 3 different lifestyle change programs, which I have listed here and I'm not going to describe, but the point is that now we've got 22 sites instead of just 4 or 5, and we have 155 interviews that we can draw off of instead of just 24 within a single study. So this is kind of the power of being able to synthesize across multiple studies. Click next. So when looking at the intersetting domain, for example, click next. Networks and communications, you can see, which I mentioned earlier, is really important distinguishing or determinant of implementation success regardless of the program, regardless of the type of program. So these 3 programs all have different characteristics. Click next. On the other hand, when you look at a variable like leadership engagement or a construct like leadership engagement, it was a key determinant for 2 of the programs. And so then when you look at those programs, it begins to give you insights under what circumstances is leadership engagement important and what does it look like for those types of programs in that particular context. Click next. So what can we learn? What can this information, go ahead and click next, tell us about global health or the applicability to global health? So based on 2 studies that I identified below that actually referred to the CFIR or used the CFIR to kind of organize their conclusions, first of all, that there is, in global health research, there is a lack of reporting of context and implementation information. And this really kind of leaves policymakers in the dark about how to best set up infrastructure or disseminate programs so that in a way that they can be taken up or implemented efficiently and successfully. We really need to do systematic evaluation of context to inform strategies that then can be tailored to local settings. And then this information can be used then to inform policymakers to avoid pitfalls in their efforts to scale up and implement. So that's, thank you very much. And I've got a link here to CFIR technical support site and then also another link to basic information on implementation that is really kind of a plethora of resources that the VA has put together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was a great presentation and actually connects with a lot of the discussions we've been having here internally. Part of the idea from this webinar actually came from seeing so many of our own internal conversations about implementation reflected in implementation science literature, like many of the points you bring in the CFIR. And there are many questions that we've been exploring here, and some of them have even at times been uncomfortable, but 2 of the main ones are these. What value do implementers add in the reading and understanding of context? And what would it take to capacitate us as implementers and our partners to live into that role as readers of context? So to go big picture for a moment, if we can all agree that at the end of the day the main objective of implementation is to ensure that our interventions are optimally beneficial to the communities and the health systems we seek to serve, then an understanding of context has probably pervasive implications for how we work. Maybe 2 of the biggest ones are ones that in many ways we already know, but that aren't necessarily reflected in the ways we're set up to operate. The first is that implementers are in the best position to gauge shifts in context. We're the first to see the changes, the first to read these changes' implications for our interventions, and the first to recommend ways of adjusting based on the new realities that we're observing. Which brings us to the second point. If context is messy and dynamic, then the only constant is change. Adjusting to new realities is actually the rule, not the exception. And a lot of these issues are already being raised in implementation science literature. So we're just going to look very quickly at 2 examples from the field, one from an E2A project in Niger, and then one from Pathfinder, the Geração BIZ project in Mozambique. But without further delay, I'll hand over the reins to Joseph Petralia.
Great. Thank you, Claire. A project that Regina Benavides of Evidence to Action and I are assisting in Niger is a stark reminder of something I think every implementer knows. Just when you think nothing else can go wrong, it does, and sometimes spectacularly. Very briefly, the 2-year USAID-funded project entitled Leadership Universitaire pour Changement de Comportement is designed to work with both university peer educators and university health services to create and fulfill demand for family planning and reproductive health services at the Abdou Maimouni University in Niamey. It's the I believe it's the only university in the country. It's very large. It's got about 20,000 students. And as these students are the intelligentsia, the future intelligentsia of the country, E2A felt this was a very important cadre of students to target. Working in close coordination with the Ministry of Public Health, a group of elected student leaders at the university. These were students that there's a very structured student leadership organization at the university in which each faculty nominates and elects one student representative. These student representatives were brought together and instructed through this project in adolescent and youth sexual and reproductive health, behavior change, and given some practice facilitating peer education. As part of the project, monitoring protocols were established, templates were designed, and ministry partners were engaged in a supervisory capacity and have worked very closely with us from the inception. But shortly after a series of trainings were completed, and of course our training budget was largely depleted, we were about to begin the demand-side activities when political unrest took place in the country, and this resulted in most of this cadre of student leaders being jailed. We kept track of their well-being, of course, while in jail, and I'm happy to say they were only in jail for a relatively brief period, but even after they were released, the university was closed for several weeks. This led us to have to confront a reality that we had to implement without implementers at a critical period, and we didn't really have access to our primary intervention site. Now, what's interesting about this, and this is sort of happening very much in real time. Just this morning, I heard that the religious leaders in the country have now sort of joined together to come out against sexual and reproductive health education. Something else we couldn't have anticipated. But it's interesting in the present context to consider that as implementers, we were and are required to think fast about the contextual reality shifting beneath our feet. Whatever set of best practices we intended to implement had to be completely reimagined. The mHealth component had to be radically rethought. Our targets have been revised. Our indicators have had to be adjusted. And our M&E protocols retooled completely to deal with the lack of implementers at a critical junction in, again, what is a relatively short-term project. We're proceeding with the project, and we're trying to get a level of stability. I thought we had attained that until, as I say, this morning we heard that religious leaders are now coming out against sexual and reproductive health as an educational component in secondary schools. But the project that we're currently doing is very different from the project we had begun to implement. As to what we've learned from this experience, it's clear that the skills that we and our local counterparts were required to exercise bear scant resemblance to what a typical researcher-oriented approach to implementation science would recommend. The principles that are central to this project's continued viability are unlike anything we could have anticipated, but I suspect they are really core and have significant relevance for many other university-based projects in the developing world.
Thank you so much, Joseph. We definitely want to have a chance to discuss that further. I'm just going to move on quickly to our second example, which is from Mozambique. The Geração BIZ program began in 1999 as a 10-year multi-sectoral AYSRH program that was always intended for national scale, and we're glad to say that today it still continues under government leadership. Like the Niger example, peer education is a major part of the project design for Geração BIZ and involves both female and male peer educators working in and out of school youth settings. So PGB had a phased approach. There was a formative research phase, a pilot phase in the first year, and then went on to scale up following that. So after the pilot, after the formative research, midway through scale up, the team actually observed a fairly major problem. Peer educators were dropping out at very high rates, particularly female peer educators. There was a 25% loss of male peer educators and a 30% loss for female peer educators. And so also reading that there was probably a gender dynamic at play in this drop-off, the PGB team decided to apply for funding for a formal inquiry. They applied to ICRW and they received that funding and then sort of designed an implementation inquiry team so that the inquiry was embedded within their own implementation. The results had significant implications for the design of the project. They found a lot of things, but among them were some pretty heavy-hitting aspects of their own peer education intervention design. So to do recruitment for the community-based peer educators, they've gone through community leaders, and they found that the community leaders, whether rightly or wrongly, had inferred that they may receive some kind of financial remuneration for their participation in recruiting these peer educators, and so they had chosen youth who were close to them, not necessarily youth who were influential in the community, and not necessarily youth who were particularly even interested in the work of peer educators, which you can imagine might lead to some problems in the long run. And then for in-school peer educators, they had gone through the teachers, and teachers had chosen high-performing students. And so similar in some ways, high-performing students may be great at getting good grades, but they may not be as influential with their peers. And so when they began their activities, they were also finding a challenging environment. No one was listening, and so that was also contributing to dropout. And then speaking to this gender dynamic, they also found that the peer educators were meeting with different experiences, let's say at home. Male peer educators were meeting with, in some ways, a norm that mapped well to their peer education work. Families were expecting that young men would have work outside of the home, and so the peer education responsibilities were supported. Whereas for female peer educators, they were coming home to an environment that really expected that any activity that would happen outside of the home would be second to completion of domestic duties. And so when there was conflict, and there often was because the peer education work was not little, they were meeting with resistance, and that was contributing to their own dropout. So based on this, PGB decided to make some significant changes. They were, as I mentioned, they'd already come through their pilot, they were already in scale-up, they already had their peer educator cadre, but they decided to kind of take some steps back and regroup. So first, instead of going through school teachers and community leaders, they decided to post ads in the community and allow youth to self-select to be peer educators. And once applicants came in, they went through mock exercises, which allowed the youth to kind of get the feel for what it would be like to be a peer educator, as well as the project to observe, let's say, natural talent among the youth applicants for selection. They also changed their training. They went from a 24-hour training to a 60-hour training, and they made sure that parents were a major part of the full first day. So parents actually came out after the first day with an Activista certificate to kind of allow them to have a sense of ownership of the intervention itself. And recruitment was 50-50 male and female, which also kind of enabled them to track dropout in the future. So with all of this, it was a near complete revision to the design of the intervention, and this was, again, 2 years after the pilot phase. So it had major implications for cost, for the work plan, for the established indicators. And as I mentioned, the redesigned model is now part of a national program, still being run by the government. So in many ways, we would consider it a success story. But if we just want to kind of take a moment and compare these two examples, they really demonstrate two things primarily. One is the importance of implementers' understanding of context. Clearly, it's affecting both of these stories, let's say. And then, in addition, it's incredibly normal for context to change within the lifespan of a project. In Niger, we have an extreme example in many ways. I'm sure no one on the line would argue that you have to adapt and change your blueprint when faced with something like this. In one political event, Joseph and his colleagues lost their implementers, their target population, and their intervention setting. So it's even arguable.
Apart from that, it was great.
Yeah, it's been a ball. So it's arguable that it's a situation that was unforeseeable. And then by contrast, though, with the PGB example, though it's a very successful program that we're frankly quite proud of, you could say that the social and gender dynamics that were causing the disruption should have been foreseen. And I'm sure folks on the line can think of their own examples of projects where you crossed your T's and dotted your I's, you went through your formative research phase, you thought you knew your context, and then as you start to implement, turns out you didn't see something or something changes. So in both of these scenarios, the response was adaptation. In Niger's example, it sounds as though you're working well with the donors to sort of remap yourselves to these new realities. And in Mozambique's example, in part because the team was able to go in some ways out of its way to get funding to do this formal inquiry and have the evidence to back up your changes, you were able to meet with a supportive donor environment to do that. So in both of these examples, we might say in some ways all's well that ends well. But if we want to go back to the implementation science literature, it seems like there might be some larger lessons to learn in terms of the need for a shift in the way we think about our expectations of ourselves as implementers and maybe those that others have of us as implementers. So we've been reading a lot here, and we'd love to put all the articles up, but we chose a favorite. This is David Chambers' Dynamic Sustainability Framework, and we chose 3 quotes just to pull out here for discussion. The first depicts nicely what we think is a scenario that majority of implementation rolls out in today, and Laura Damschroeder, you actually spoke to this a bit in your presentation. We have evidence-based interventions that get designed and tested, and we think of them in some ways as the goal is to keep them frozen as we disseminate them across new settings. So we design our projects based on the evidence, we apply for funding to implement these interventions, and then as a normal course of process, we set up our work plan, our blueprint, and we sort of imply that things should stay the same throughout the course of the project. And by doing this, we're aiming for fidelity, and we're inviting our partners, our donors, our ministries of health to look for fidelity as well. But by contrast, the dynamic sustainability framework is kind of calling out a different truth, that in fact interventions are never optimal to their context at outset, and the goal of implementation should be rapid learning, nimble problem solving throughout the course of implementation. The goal should be iterative programming. And then in this last quote, Chambers goes even further, saying that implementers should be generators of new knowledge based on these experiences. So if we go back to Joseph's Niger example, and I think you were already alluding to this in many ways, maybe the situation was unforeseeable. But on the other hand, if we were already part of a global health community of implementers who saw ourselves as generators of new knowledge, then maybe we could have foreseen some of this. Maybe we would have already learned from implementers who were working in countries where there was only one large university, where there was political turmoil, where the student union was home to a lot of the intellectual elite, and they wouldn't be able to tell us that it's likely that they would be targets in a time of unrest. Maybe we would have diversified our peer educator cadre. We probably would have done a number of things differently. But as it is, we're not exactly able to really stand on each other's shoulders as implementers because we're not aggregating this kind of information about context. Maybe the CFIR offers us a framework to kind of think about how we could take the messiness of context and make it something that we could try to not control, but be more systematic about learning from. So where do we go from here? We're hoping that the discussion can really cover that. We have a few thoughts that we just wanted to throw out. The first is that if we can agree that context is complex, dynamic, and constantly changing, then in this reality, real-time adaptation is a hallmark of good implementation that should be encouraged. And then if we can buy into that, then there are probably several aspects of how we work as implementers and how we're expected to work that may need to change. Going back to the earlier question, what would it take to capacitate us and our partners to live into the role of readers of and learners from context? Some things to consider. Maybe we can get better at flexing our muscle in terms of knowing how we're staying focused on the how, the process. We seem pretty good at looking at the what, but are we really understanding our process? Better seeing and embracing the unexpected seems something that we can try and think about. Understanding that the unexpected is actually not a failure, but something to learn from that we should really capture and harness. And then if we want to look at this even further, then maybe we can also expand the way we think about monitoring. Bring in new inquiries, bring in new methods. The PGB example, they actually designed their own inquiry, and that's good, and we would like to see more of that. But could we also make this type of watching something that answers the questions that we really want to get at? How do we need to change monitoring to think about that? And then with all of this, if we want to make this actually a part of how we implement, if we want implementation science to sort of pierce the veneer of our implementation fray, then do we need some practical guidelines, some ready tools to help us do this in a day-to-day basis so it's a living, breathing part of how we work? What would that look like? So we really want to get to discussion, and we really want to hear from our respondents. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nandita.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the wonderful presentations. I'm going to just make a few points. I'll try to be fast so we can get to this discussion. But first, just recognizing that at USAID, a lot of our research agenda has always been centered around this idea of implementation, especially compared with some of our other sister agencies like NIH. So we have always sort of had this eye on how do we really move evidence-based practices, program implementation in our many country programs to achieve these larger goals of reducing poverty, improving health, etc. So given that, I just wanted to make a few quick points. One, as we're designing our research agendas, we want to make sure that our questions are really informed by the gaps that we see in the field. So gaps that we've noticed through implementation should then be used to inform the research agendas. So we're not just conducting research for research's sake, but we're actually conducting research based on field needs. The second point is that we really need to be open to different types of methodologies. We all know that the gold standard for research is the randomized controlled trial, but when we're talking about implementation science, this is not always a feasible methodology. So really trying to understand and use different types of methods to move this agenda forward is important. The third point is around context, which I won't talk much about because we've heard a lot about this, just to say that it's particularly important when we're thinking about global health because we are working in such a diverse range of countries, political contexts, populations, etc. The fourth point, to build on what Laura mentioned earlier, thinking about dissemination, implementation, and adding this idea of sustainability. So we're really focused on not only expanding interventions, but really institutionalizing them and making them sustainable. So this involves efforts around laws, regulations, changing guidelines, etc. But really focusing on the sustainability piece is important in a global health context. And then finally, documentation. And we heard and we all know that there are a lot of gaps in terms of documenting what didn't work, for example, or what are the challenges around implementation. So we've really been trying to encourage our partners to really document beyond just project reports and try and publish some of these challenges in peer-reviewed journals, etc. And just a little plug for a new journal, the Journal of Global Health Science and Practice. It's a collaboration between USAID, Johns Hopkins University, and the George Washington University. They really are encouraging implementers to publish some of these implementation challenges in a peer-reviewed platform. So those are the 5 quick points I wanted to make, and I'll leave it at that so we can leave some time for discussion. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Nandita. And now I'll just transition over to Laura.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start with a couple of thoughts maybe for the discussion. And I think some of the important messages include that the lessons that we've learned today are relevant both for routine program implementation and improving the quality of programs, as well as implementation researchers looking at how do we generate evidence in order to inform programs and policies. And I think that it really acknowledges that there are certain tensions that exist as we look at implementing programs and translating what we know into practice at both the design, documentation, interpretation, and response level. And these are just mentioning a few of them that we can discuss. And clearly we understand that in the global health realm, particularly we look at simple guidelines, policies that can be implemented in a relatively straightforward method. But this really focuses then on the one-size-fits-all model, that you can have a policy and a guideline that can then be trained on the policy or the guideline, and therefore it will be implemented. But that obviously is a tension between what we've discussed today in terms of the context-specific implementation of that guidance, the how to do it within different settings, that oftentimes we don't train people on how to think about how to interpret that activity at within their particular setting. Secondly, the tension that we always have in terms of minimizing sort of data collection and reporting burden within the context of programs or ministries, and yet the need for documentation of not only the fidelity to the intervention or the program that we're talking about, but the response to that lack of fidelity, why things weren't implemented in the way that they were designed to. Why was this supposed to happen, didn't happen, and what were the responses in order to make that happen? And the documentation of those pieces are often missing. We may know that a site performs well or doesn't perform well, but in order to dig deeper into why that might be or what might be associated with success or not, the data are often not available or routinely collected. Thirdly, the tension between generating generalizable implementation research results, that we always talk about the goal of research is to have generalizable results, and yet the context specificity of those results. So maybe the goal isn't to have generalizable results, but to be able to understand the results that are obtained in different settings. So to allow us to tease out the contexts in which something is successful or not successful, where it might work or might not. Can you identify specific settings where a particular intervention may work well or another one where it may not? And then lastly, we talked about this sort of scientific rigor and to be able to define our interventions and our outcomes and our measures in order to get the belief in the results, yet the need, as we've seen the two examples, for the flexibility and adaptability that's required for program implementation. So how do we plan in advance in all of our programs to think through these tensions? They're not that they're not solvable, but that they have to be thought through in addressing how we might plan for these eventualities in the context of our studies, but also in terms of our programs. How do we adapt? Looking at a QI model, quality improvement model, for example, that may be common at a site level, how do you look at that in a program model to look at incorporating routinely differences in performance and what might be affected for those results? That's basically, I think, some of the thoughts that maybe can lead to some discussion on how might we think about how to generate the evidence needed given these tensions in terms of program implementation and then generating evidence.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was excellent. As I mentioned, we really want to get to discussion, so I have a colleague here, Kate, who's going to help field questions, and I'll hand it over to her.
Okay, the first question that we've received from the group is directed towards Joseph. The question is, were Niger peer educators jailed due to association with the project that was being implemented or for other reasons?
Yeah, the quick answer to that is it was for other reasons, having nothing to do with their participation in our particular project.
Okay, next question. This is for Nandita. The question is, you talk about rigorous but realistic methods. I'm wondering how you can have both in real-world context lend themselves to highly structured methods. It seems like there is a conflict between the constantly shifting context of implementation and rigor in the traditional sense. So is it realistic to be rigorous?
That's a great point and a great question. And I think it depends on the innovation or the intervention that we're talking about. So for example, if we're talking about biomedical interventions, et cetera, of course we need to be using our standard level of rigor, clinical trials, et cetera. Implementation research involves new ways of delivering services, for example, or the use of new tools. And for some of those interventions, the point here is that maybe we don't need randomized trials to test the efficacy or the effectiveness of those interventions. That said, we can still be rigorous, and I think a lot of times we're using new approaches to things without the rigorous monitoring and evaluation that's needed to really inform the evidence base. So I think it's a difficult balance, but I do think it's possible, particularly when we think about qualitative methods, quasi-experimental designs, even pre and post types of designs. But it really depends, again, on the context of the population that you're working in and also the intervention that we're testing or that we're trying to implement.
Okay, thank you. Just as a reminder, if you do have a question, feel free to type it into your chat box and send it to us. The next question is directed again towards Pathfinder. It says, it sounded like all of the speakers talked about adaptation, but how does that work in practical terms? In the case that was given of Niger, what is there to adapt when it seems like the lesson is that everything is unpredictable?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. A word that came up earlier, I think it was Laura Dam-Schroeder that used it, is heuristics. And then Laura Gay mentioned sort of what is a generalizable, or the issue of generalizability. And for me, those two comments are kind of linked, because I think what may be sort of generalizable are certain rules of thumb rather than specific, anything very specified, anything very specific. I think with the aggregation of experience over time, I think Claire spoke about that, certain heuristics can be produced, and those can be sort of brought to new contexts. In the case of Niger, I think, and I think Claire actually touched on some of these, I think having a better understanding of the political role a university plays in a country where there is only one major university, understanding the political dynamics within the university, understanding that these students who were elected are actually part of the intelligentsia in the country, and that they're going to be targets for special attention by the government in times of political unrest. These are things that in hindsight make absolute sense, but I think had we had more of a sort of implementer-oriented implementation science perspective, we would have probably anticipated that more.
I think kind of building on that, actually, when we think about adaptation, and Laura Gay, you mentioned it earlier, that there's this other, maybe not a limitation, but a challenge in making sure that our implementer teams actually have the skill set to sort of do the problem solving, to interpret the information that they're reading. If we can collect it systematically, how do we make sure that we're also understanding what it means and making evidence-informed adaptations? We're not pursuing adaptation willy-nilly, but actually, in a meaningful way in response to context. So, Joseph, I think it was an article that you actually brought to our team from, was it Green, that was talking about the importance of sort of narrating the problem solving to build that muscle, that skill set, and that's part of a conscious adaptation as a skill set that's expected of implementers, but not really something that necessarily is reflected in the sort of brick and mortar, if you will, of how we implement. So what would it take to actually make that, more than just an icing on the cake, kind of, oh, communities of practice and KM are wonderful, aren't they? Extra, but actually seeing that as not the icing on the cake, but the cake itself, that that's what's really core to adaptation.
Yeah.
How would we move towards that? I think is another interesting question in terms of thinking about adaptation.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question. This is from an individual doing research on the implementation of quality improvement programs in Haiti. He says that one of the key aspects is the interaction between the context, the dynamics of the actors, the power relation among the actors, and how that influences the implementation. The question to the general audience is, do we need to take into account the power dynamic among the actors and how that would influence implementation?
I think we could probably all speak to that, so I won't take up time.
But the CFIR does actually, I mean, maybe Laura Damschroeder, you'd like to speak to this, because the CFIR does touch on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a great example of a finding. It sounds like you're discovering that maybe the power dynamic is important in that particular context, or in the context that you're working within, and the intervention being QI, which really is not only learning skills, but really kind of a culture change in terms of how people approach these QI type initiatives and continuous QI. And so I think that if you have that as a finding, then yes, you need to conceptualize that as either part of the working relationships, because we're talking about at least dyads, probably collectives or groups or teams or units within the entities or organizations within which you're trying to do this, the implementation of these QI techniques or QI programs. So absolutely, and I think that that's something, I mean, that is really the wonderful thing about having these kind of high-level, rich descriptions of constructs. And so what you bring to the table then is, hey, not only, like, how do we define quality and the nature of networks and communications? Well, maybe power dynamics under these, the scenario, or these factors, or these local factors, is a really important characteristic of those working relationships. And I would also say that that's probably true in many contexts.
Right. Great.
This is Laura Gay.
This is Nandita. Go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to say, I think this also is really a critical issue when you're talking about ministry or government programs in terms of where they're functions are centralized or disseminated out into the districts or into the facilities. The sense of the individuals as to whether they are able to alter or adapt what's been given to them will be critical, I think, to whether creative solutions to problems are created at the ground level versus people waiting to hear from above what they should do.
Mm-hmm. This is Nandita, and I would just add to my colleagues and say, you know, we often talk about global health and development as being both a science and an art. And I think this is a good example of where that art piece really comes in, because it's not always easy to fit something like that into a scientific framework or context. So really thinking about the art of development is true when you're talking about managing relationships or managing power dynamics. And the other point I would make is when you are working in fields like that, it's really important to, again, document those experiences and really be able to share that with the wider global audience, because that is an issue that many are faced with. And really being able to share and document that is just going to help further the field.
Okay, and given that we have 3 minutes left, this will be the last question. The question is, for the two projects, how did you manage to quickly change the original design of your projects without losing your grants? I am looking for donor reactions.
Thank you so much. That's a great point, and I'm sure that actually Nandita can respond to that. But really quickly, we actually also have our technical director here, Julio Paca, who was head of PGB at that time, and I know you navigated a lot to do that, so maybe you could speak to this as well.
Yeah, very quickly. Maybe because PGB was designed to be a national program, and we create some features there that create an opportunity to have this kind of a conversation. And for instance, every year we have an annual review meeting with the donors, with the implementers, the supporting agencies, Pathfinder and UNFPA, and with the representatives of the 3 ministries that we are working with, and with the adolescents who are the beneficiaries. So that creates an opportunity to discuss and see, hey, seriously, how we are going to move this project along, you see, considering all of these variables, all of these facts that are interfering in our efficacy. So that, the way that we set up politically the project allow that. So, and we need to have this kind of conversations with donors and implementers in a frank way.
Nandita, do you also want to respond to that?
Sure, I can just comment. I think at least in a global health perspective, I think many donors recognize the challenges on the ground and recognize that there are going to be instances where things are going to change, and we have mechanisms in place that allow for that in terms of the types of grants or the types of mechanisms that we award, so that they are somewhat flexible. That said, as Julio mentioned, really keeping the donors involved is important to make sure that if there are changes, everyone is still on the same page. And then the final point is, you know, at the end of the day, we're looking for impact and documentation of that impact. And so even if directions change, if we're able to document and show some impact, I think that's, at the end of the day, that's probably the most important thing that we're looking for.
Thank you so much, Nandita. And I guess actually we're at time now, so hopefully you've been titillated enough to want to continue this conversation. Quickly, I just want to mention that there's the IBP semi-annual meeting will be in December, and we're actually holding a reception between the Implementation Science and Dissemination Conference and the start of the IBP semi-annual meeting that we hope you guys can attend. Hopefully you can see the slide up here now. It'll be the evening of December 9th. And so we have also contact information here for folks who've been involved in today's webinar. So hopefully we can use this as a continuation of the conversation that's begun in the global health community towards an implementer-oriented implementation science. Thank you so much to Nandita, to Laura Damschroeder, to Laura Gay for joining us, and to everyone on the line. We're really grateful for your participation.